Chapter 2. Down Memory Lane. I looked past the fact that both guys needed a haircut and was amazed by what I saw on that workbench. Mike Markkula. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I find it helpful to provide some background on the operating system to better understand the foundations of the massive company that is Apple. This will help us connect many dots later when all we have are events, or audits, to look at in order to determine why the operating system is behaving oddly. Apple's inception is rooted in a time period dubbed the Computer Wars. Technology moved quickly during this time, and due to Apple's unique platform, there was a lot of terminology created specific to their ecosystem. I myself find a lot of these terms confusing and often used inaccurately, so here I'm going to provide the story and the terms as directly as possible. As many know, Apple was co-founded by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, with each of them owning a 45% stake of the company. What about the other 10%? This belonged to a third individual named Ronald Wayne. After a few days, Wayne decided the investment was too risky and backed out. His payout came to $2,300, which, had he remained a stakeholder, would have been worth roughly $40 billion today. However, one could still argue he made a logical decision at the time. There's really interesting history between the two Steves' friendship. Prior to the existence of Apple, the two teamed up to sell a device that Wozniak built that used phone phreaking techniques to make long-distance calls for free. They called it the Blue Box. Jobs took it on to sell this creation as a product, but his attempts to sell this device on the street actually led to him getting robbed at gunpoint. This perhaps laid the foundation for a greater partnership where Wozniak, who was a brilliant electronics engineer at this time, would design technology and Jobs would help package, market, and sell. The name Apple was chosen on somewhat of a whim. It was a word that felt simple and inviting, two words that Jobs wanted to apply to personal computing, which in the 1970s didn't apply at all. Jobs was also on a strange fruit-only diet, perhaps making the word Apple come more readily to mind. And as an added bonus, it would put them ahead of Atari in the phone books. Early Apple technology. Apple I, 1976. The Apple I was Apple's first official product. It came after the two Steves had become attending a club made up of technology enthusiasts titled the Homebrew Computer Club. This club inspired Wozniak to map out his idea for the personal computer. Woz, who is defined by many as a lovable hacker who just wanted to share his passion with other enthusiasts, claims he never would have thought to sell this as a product. That was where Jobs came in. Apple was created based on the idea that there was a consumer market for Wozniak's personal computer design. Overall, the design looked like a generic circuit board, but its big selling point was that it had all the components built right into it and had a usable keyboard. Through an impressed contact at the Homebrew Computer Club, Jobs was able to strike an agreement to get the Apple I sold at a local computer shop. About 200 of these computers were built, and about 175 are known to have been sold. Apple II, 1977. As far as technology went for personal computing, the Apple I held up quite nicely. However, when it came to sleekness and presentation, it might have been obvious that Jobs and Wozniak were building them at the Jobs household with help from friends and family. Competitors were primarily large tech companies with far more design power than Apple. So shortly thereafter, in 1977, Apple became Apple Incorporated. And they set out to fix these design issues with the creation of the Apple II. It was a packaged all-in-one computer and set a tone for how Apple would be doing things moving forward. The Apple II was very popular and boosted them into a wildly successful financial state. In fact, from the start of its life in 1977 all the way to 1993, roughly 6 million of these computers sold. This computer was primarily designed by Steve Wozniak and appealed to many hardcore computer users. It would also end up being the last computer that Apple built with Wozniak as the primary designer. Without this computer, Apple likely would have never become the tech giant that we know today. Speaking of tech giants, A small company named Microsoft was also finding their footing right around the time the Apple II was released. Apple III, 1980. 3 years after the release of the Apple II came the Apple III. Honestly, there isn't much to say about it. Most of Apple's major releases and versions were to support the quickly evolving hardware during this time. Apple was also providing decent operating system upgrades and pretty good support in terms of video games. But sadly, the Apple III, meant to be the ultimate hobbyist computer, was a flop due to its high price, stability issues, and lack of commercial sales. Wozniak complained that this was due to the fact that it was designed by marketing experts rather than engineers. It was such a fail that Apple stopped building the Apple III 8 years before they stopped building the Apple II. Only an estimated 65,000 of these computers were sold. Let's turn our eyes back to what's going on at Microsoft, as this is important. Microsoft's focus had primarily been in software up to this point, but just a few months prior to the release of the Apple III, they released a piece of hardware called the Z80 soft card. This card could be patched into the Apple II, allowing the user to run the popular at the time CP/M operating system. It also worked with the Apple III upon its debut. Microsoft brought in great revenue from this piece of hardware, as well as by writing software for Apple. The relationship between the two was pretty solid, and at this point in time, it seemed like a further partnership might just come into play. However, all of that changed just a few months after the Apple III was launched. It was at that time that Microsoft signed an agreement to package their MS-DOS operating system with the IBM personal computer while maintaining the right to sell the operating system to other vendors. Successful sales of the IBM personal computer began applying pressure on Apple. Lisa, 1983. The Apple Lisa is a big moment in computer history. It was the first consumer computer to use a graphical user interface, or GUI, and the first Apple device to feature a mouse with point-and-click capabilities. A year later, Windows added mouse support to MS-DOS. However, they would not end up launching a full GUI-based operating system until 1985 with Windows 1.0. Perhaps the most interesting detail of this novel concept was that Apple did not invent it. The company Xerox had built the original concept of using a bitmap screen for controlling a computer. Xerox had invested $1 million in Apple, and Jobs demanded that they share this research once he'd heard of it. Apple took this idea and made computers usable for everyone with draggable and resizable windows. Jobs commented on this technology heist by quoting Picasso, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." And we have always been shameless about stealing. An ironic statement, as Jobs was notably furious after Microsoft decided to piggyback on the GUI concept. Unfortunately, despite the introduction of this user-friendly technology, the Apple Lisa was also a flop, only selling around 60,000 units. This could partially be due to the $10,000 price tag and a large number of bugs in the operating system. But it was for sure related to some internal drama going on within the company during its design. Prior to the release of the Lisa, many engineers were complaining about Jobs being impossible to work with, which led to his removal from the Lisa project. That didn't deter Jobs. Instead, he built a small team of people within Apple that he deemed worthy to work with him. Their project was a secretive product titled the Macintosh, a product that would quickly make the Lisa obsolete. But more on that later. Apple had been operating for the past 2 years with interim CEO Mike Markkula. Keep in mind that up to this point, Steve Jobs had never been the CEO of Apple, as he was not yet fit for the position. Jobs spent a lot of time and effort in attempts to convince John Sculley to come and take the role. Sculley, who has worked his way up the ladder to become CEO of Pepsi, was hesitant, but he eventually gave in to Jobs' persistence. Among Jobs' arguments is the famous quote, "Do you want to spend the rest of your life selling sugared water, or do you want a chance to change the world?" The Macintosh, 1984. Finally, we arrive at the Macintosh. The name has remained a staple in Apple's lineup, from iMacs to MacBooks to Mac Minis and beyond. It was released just a year after the Apple Lisa introduced the GUI to users' fingertips and before Microsoft launched Windows. For Steve Jobs, the Macintosh was seen as a direct competitor to the Lisa. As you can imagine, such a mindset may have doomed the Apple Lisa from the beginning. Many who worked on the Macintosh project claim to have been pushed way too hard and have both fond and dark memories of the time. They recalled being overworked and overstressed, and yet finding some amazement in what they were actually able to accomplish. Upon its release, the Macintosh was significantly cheaper than the Lisa, with a price tag right around $2,500. Much of that had to do with the fact that it was much more limited in hardware. Apple teased its release at Super Bowl XVIII by promoting it with a commercial directed by Ridley Scott that caught the attention of many. The ad depicted IBM, whose market share was steadily growing, as a new villain in town, and that Apple was here to fight the power. This commercial is still considered one of the best of its time. After its initial unveiling, the Macintosh flew off the shelves at a rate higher than predicted. However, things soon took a turn for the worse. The Plot Thickens, 1985. Over the course of 2 years, the relationship between John Sculley and Steve Jobs had slowly deteriorated. Sculley, a people pleaser, had little respect for the way Jobs treated people both inside and outside the company, while Jobs became increasingly frustrated with the lack of interest Sculley showed in understanding Apple products. Jobs ultimately blamed him for the declining sales of the Macintosh, while the IBM PC market launched Microsoft into an explosive growth. Jobs made a habit of talking poorly of Sculley behind his back, planting seeds that he should be thrown out of the company. Meanwhile, Sculley planned to remove Jobs from the Macintosh division and instead place him with the head of a new Apple research team where he could cause less drama within the company. Ultimately, after each individual pled his case to the board sided with Sculley. Jobs' reputation for being brash and unfiltered had begun to affect the company. Moving him to a smaller division with less influence seemed like it would be best for everyone. It's interesting to think where Apple would be today if Jobs had agreed to this arrangement, for better or for worse. After a final attempt at a coup behind Sculley's back, Jobs left Apple and took a handful of talented engineers with him. Mach, Next, and NeXTSTEP. You might have noticed we haven't spoken about the operating system running on any of the discussed Apple devices yet. This is because, from a threat hunting perspective, they do not matter. In fact, everything up to this point was basically just a fun history lesson. The operating system that would one day become known as macOS had not been created yet. Interestingly enough, the core of this operating system will be built outside of Apple. The company Next was started in 1985, immediately following Jobs' departure from Apple. At the same time, Carnegie Mellon released an impressive new technology known as the Mach microkernel. This microkernel was originally meant to be a swap-in kernel for the one being used by the BSD operating system. The BSD operating system ran on a kernel that had been grown to be quite large in size by 1985. A large monolithic kernel can lead to performance issues, especially back when hardware was less impressive than it is today. Mach aimed to address this with parallel computing. What set this concept apart at the time was its ability to pass messages between processes via shared memory, a feature that, in theory, could significantly improve the way Unix shared data through pipes. The entire idea of a microkernel is to keep the kernel code minimal and move all other functionality to user space. Ultimately, the goal is to break the system into multiple components that can all talk to each other. In this case, using a new communication protocol called Mach ports. Over time, Carnegie Mellon released 3 versions of the Mach kernel. They didn't actually achieve a fully functioning microkernel until the release of Mach 3. Everything prior to that had been BSD 4.3, with Mach concepts slowly worked in. Upon monitoring the Mach microkernel project, Next took great interest. Jobs flew out and met with Avi Tevanian, one of the lead developers on the project. Over time, Jobs convinced Tevanian to join Next, apply his knowledge of Mach, and assist in developing a full operating system. This part of the story is very important. Over the course of this book, we will get into some of the difficulties of threat hunting on macOS. Many of these difficulties stem from the beautiful but difficult concept of Mach ports that are integrated into the foundation of the operating system. Tevanian and team set to work on what was essentially a forked version of the Carnegie Mellon project. He joined Next around the time Mach 2 had been released. The idea of completing a full microkernel was pushed aside to instead bring more expandable features into the Mach/BSD hybrid that already existed. One of these useful features was DriverKit. DriverKit was designed to allow third parties to write drivers in order to extend functionality of the operating system. Another feature was a heavy implementation of the Objective-C programming language, a language that Next licensed through a company called Stepstone. It was a language used within DriverKit as well as one that could be used with the operating system's application builder. After bringing all these features together with many different user additions, including a fully loaded Oxford Dictionary, we get what is known as the NeXTSTEP operating system. This operating system at its core was fairly different than what was currently available to the consumer market. It was intuitive enough at the high level for any given user to jump in and quickly familiarize themselves with the layout. Much of the original NeXTSTEP developer documentation can still be found online today and includes very useful details regarding the concepts of Mach. Very little modern-day documentation exists on such topics since higher-level technologies have been built on top of Mach, which we will get into later. This operating system was initially packaged with a variety of Next-built workstations, including the Next Computer, 1988, later renamed the Next Cube and Next Station, 1990. Next's original target was the education sector, but over time turned its gaze to the business sector, seeing Sun Microsystems as their main competitor. Despite good design and respectable hardware, the Next computers did not sell overly well. Over the course of 5 years, roughly 50,000 computers were sold. Despite having good concepts, Next was failing to capture a user base. In 1993, Next decided to stop building computers and instead focus solely on software. This ultimately led to the launch of OpenStep, 1994. It gets a little confusing here as OpenStep is the name of two different technologies. In this case, OpenStep is an API. It allowed developers to build applications using Next's application building tooling. This didn't require the developer to be using an operating system with the Mach kernel, and even included support for Windows. Sun Microsystems, once seen as a competitor, assisted in bringing this project to life, allowing developers to build Next-style applications in the Solaris environment. Separate from OpenStep the API, Next also created OpenStep the operating system, which was essentially a rebranded NeXTSTEP operating system. The Prodigal Son Returns. Now, fortunately for Next, the past 9 years had not been overly kind to Apple. In fact, its market share had gone down from around 16% at the time of Jobs' departure in 1985, all the way down to 4% in 1996. Many could see signs of bankruptcy coming in the near future. Apple felt heavy negative effects upon the release of Windows 95. This downfall was accelerated by Apple's release of subpar and failed product after product. Check out the Apple Newton. Apple products continued to be limited by outdated hardware and software that was falling drastically behind. After a failed attempt to design a new age operating system named Copeland, they came to the conclusion that in order to fast-track Apple to success, they must instead purchase an operating system. Two were seen as potential options. One called BOS, and one, as you probably suspected by now, called NeXTSTEP. Apple took this decision seriously, and legend has it that they based the decision on a bake-off between the two. It's said that after the presentation, the decision forward was undoubtedly Next. Jobs and Tavanian both managed to impress those making the decision. Apple acquired Next for over $400 million, thereby bringing Steve Jobs back into the company and making Avi Tavanian the head of engineering at Apple. Apple now had to get the operating system running on their computers. They spent the next 3 years doing some heavy revamping. During that time, they released Rhapsody, which was essentially a preview version of the operating system that developers could use while Apple continued their design. At its core, Rhapsody was the next step with some Apple tweaks. During this revamp, NeXTSTEP was rebased on FreeBSD rather than the previously used BSD 4.3. The driver kit Objective-C-based API was changed to a C++-based API, now called IO-Kit. If you're a veteran engineer in the Apple space, you may have even used this yourself. Objective-C continued to stick around for many other uses. A handful of additional programming frameworks were designed as well that would allow some old classic macOS applications to operate on the new OS in development if updated correctly. As we've discussed, Tavanian and team designed not a true microkernel, but a hybrid kernel made up of BSD, Mach, and IO-Kit. With these changes, Apple decided to assign a proper name to the kernel, and they chose XNU. There were some other adaptations added by Apple, but overall, it's just the latest edition of the NeXTSTEP operating system, heavily rebranded. There's another buzzword that I have yet to mention. Around the year 2000, Apple released the core components of the operating system as open source under the name Darwin. It notably left out the source for some of its main app developing components, such as the infamous Cocoa framework. This means that Mac apps wouldn't run on Darwin, but for a long time, you could download this bare-bones operating system, which was essentially the foundation of Apple's ecosystem. Unfortunately, this is no longer the case. Apple has quietly discontinued support for Darwin in its operational form, and to the best of this author's knowledge, it's now impossible to compile. Regardless, the term Darwin still represents the core of macOS and lives on in many libraries and commands that return its name when used. For example, see the book to find examples of the uname command in figures 2.1 and 2.2. The future is ready. At the time of the Next acquisition in February 1997, Apple's operating system for their Macintosh was simply called System 7, which had been released in 1991. It was later renamed to macOS 7. Shortly after the acquisition and while working on the NeXTSTEP overhaul, Apple released macOS 8 in July 1997. This was followed by macOS 9 in 1999. In 2001, the revamp of the NeXTSTEP was finally finished and it was released under the name Mac OS X. Versions 10.0 to 10.8 were all named after large cats. When 10.8 came out, Apple simplified the name from Mac OS X to OS X. Versions 10.9 on up, to the time of this writing, have all been named after various California locations. In 2016, upon the release of 10.12 Sierra, Apple once again subtly changed the official name of the operating system from OS X to Mac OS, where we find ourselves today. This author recalls this specifically due to the fact that in 2016, he had just released a book titled OS X Incident Response Scripting and Analysis just a couple months before Apple made this name change. But said author is not at all salty. The naming convention of using 10, followed by the major version release number, ran from 2001 until 2020. At that point, Apple moved from macOS 10.15 to macOS 11. Major versions of the operating system, released once per year, are now simply incremented by one. Of course, each of these releases included countless new features, capabilities, security, file systems, CPU architectures, and etc. But the point of this chapter was to familiarize you with the ground level of the operating system, which will help us do better threat hunting in the long run. And recap, here's a short list of the important terms. The Mach microkernel. Our research project at Carnegie Mellon that made an effort to improve the BSD operating system by replacing the monolithic BSD kernel. NeXTSTEP. The operating system written at the startup company Next. OpenStep. The successor to the NeXTSTEP operating system when Next decided to stop designing hardware and focus only on software. Alternatively, OpenStep would be referring to the OpenStep API, which was a way to build portable Next-style applications for various operating systems. XNU. The name of the kernel that is running at the core of macOS. At its core are Mach, BSD, and IOKit. Mach. Taken from the Mach microkernel. Mach is the part of the XNU kernel that improved inter-process communication in Unix and allowed much of the operating system to be broken up into pieces and moved into user space. Processes are capable of communicating with each other using a low-level technology called Mach ports. BSD. The Unix distribution that macOS is based on. This includes many of the file system components, such as permissions. It's why Unix users tend to feel at home on macOS. Driver kit. The portion of the NeXTSTEP kernel that made it expandable via drivers written in Objective-C. IOKit. The revamped version of DriverKit after Next was purchased by Apple. Darwin. The operational open-source portion of the OS X operating system. OS X without the Apple proprietary app functionality. Some of it is still open source today. Mac OS X. The operating system that resulted after Apple purchased Next and the two platforms were fused together. Can be thought of as a rebranded NeXTSTEP/OpenStep with Apple styling and flavor. Mac OS. The same as OS X, but with a number of updates stacked on top of it over the years. The operating system we've come to know and love.